On February 12, 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez paced around a radio station in a city called Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and all the people around him were working very hard to get ready for an urgent broadcast. So Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was a highly respected news station owned by a popular newspaper called El Comercio. Most people in Ecuador basically got all their news either from this news station or that newspaper, or both. And running a radio station with such a great reputation was really a source of pride for Leonardo, who had grown up in Quito. So he took his job very seriously, which was why tonight was such a big deal for him. He was about to deliver a potentially life-changing broadcast to the entire city. And just thinking about the gravity of this moment was making him feel sick and sweaty. In the room with Leonardo was a team of producers and sound technicians, as well as one of the station's top news anchors. Most of the last-minute work they were all doing involved organizing stacks of paper that contained instructions about what to say and what to do during this pivotal broadcast. That's what the anchor was double-checking right now. He was the one who had written the broadcast script, and he would be the one actually reading it on the air. Leonardo looked anxiously over at the clock on the wall. It was already a few minutes after 9 p.m., and they didn't have a lot of time left. But even though Leonardo desperately wanted to get this broadcast started as soon as possible, he knew he had to give his anchor the space and time to make sure they were 100% ready before they actually went on the air, because they really only had one chance to do this right. So instead of telling the anchor to come on, hurry it up, Leonardo instead bit his lip and just paced around the station, trying to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently being broadcast over the radio station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance from a duo of singers named Benitez and Valencia. These two combined were really famous, sort of like the Taylor Swift of 1940s Ecuador. And so when people in Quito knew these particular singers were performing on the radio, basically everybody stopped what they were doing and tuned in to listen. So in Quito in the 1940s, nobody had TV, and so radios were like the ultimate form of not just how to get your news, but also of entertainment. It's really where everybody turned. But radios were also very expensive and were sort of a luxury item, so not everybody had one. The people who did have radios would often bring theirs outside to the street so that other people could also hear the programs and the music. And Leonardo knew that all of this meant that at this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio. And he needed to get his broadcast on the air while he still had everybody's attention. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair, indicating he was ready, and so Leonardo knew it was time to go live. Leonardo turned and nodded to his technicians, who were all sitting at a table covered in broadcasting equipment, and one of them, after seeing Leonardo's cue, leaned forward to adjust several knobs and then hit a button on the control panel. And the instant he did this, the voices of the singing duo cut off, and a large red sign that said "On Air" lit up on the wall right above the table. Basically, they were going to cut off the performance to do this broadcast and catch everybody in Quito off guard. And then the anchor leaned into their microphone and, in a very urgent voice, said that they were interrupting this musical program because there was an alarming event happening that everybody in Quito had to hear about. Then he explained the reason for this broadcast. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, 17-year-old Jose Antonio stood outside a restaurant with some of his friends. Jose and his friends and all the diners, plus a bunch of people out on the sidewalk, had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio, listening to Benitez and Valencia sing, when suddenly the music had cut out and the anchor had come on to say that their country was under attack. And so as Jose and this group is sort of caught off guard and listening to this sudden announcement, the announcer got really emphatic and said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." And at that, Jose's mouth fell open and he felt this jolt of fear in his chest. Latacunga was only about 60 miles south of Quito. So Jose, along with everybody else around him, instinctively leaned into the radio so they could hear more about what was happening and why. But when they all did that, the broadcast suddenly stopped just as abruptly as it had come on, and the music program came back on. But the street got really quiet as Jose and the crowd just kind of stood there, waiting for something to happen. I mean, really, nobody knew how to react to this. A few people began looking up at the sky, thinking maybe warplanes might be flying overhead, and actually Jose began doing that too, wondering if, that's the next step. But there were no planes, and there were no signs of, anything that would indicate that war was happening nearby, or, whatever destroyed Latacunga was approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the echo of other radios around the city, now back to playing this musical program. But as the seconds ticked by and the crowd gradually began talking again and kind of going back to normal, some people began making jokes and suggesting that this broadcast was literally a joke, that was meant to be a prank. Others just kind of brushed the whole thing off and just went about their evening as if it had never even happened. However, Jose did notice that some of the people at the tables outside the restaurant where he was were still just kind of staring at the radio and shifting around like they were restless or uncomfortable, like clearly that broadcast had struck a nerve. Jose also kept fidgeting around and trading worried looks with his friends and the other people around him because he wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he wasn't sure was because a sudden invasion of their country had actually happened before. 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was just a kid, the much larger country of Peru had invaded Ecuador after an argument over land along a shared border. Instead of settling the argument diplomatically, the Peruvian army stormed into the disputed territory in Ecuador and conquered it pretty easily. And the fighting had only lasted for maybe about a month before Ecuador accepted that they had lost and retreated, giving up the land. But even though the fighting back then had never actually reached Quito, it had been a terrifying experience for residents of Quito because it made them realize they were not able to defend themselves against a foreign invader. But just then, as Jose and the others are sitting outside the restaurant kind of grappling with what could be going on here, how real is this, is this a prank? Just then, the music that had come back on again on the radio cut out, and once again, the broadcaster's voice came on, and they said they had an update. The enemy had landed their aircraft right on the outskirts of Quito in a northern area called Cotacayao, which was only 8 miles from the center of Quito. And suddenly Jose and the others realized that if the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south and now landed in Cotacayao in the north, then the city of Quito was effectively surrounded. But before Jose could even process this thought, another man's voice came on the radio. And unlike the first voice, which was emphatic but, basically calm, this guy was absolutely panicked. He said he was the chief of Quito's newspaper, and then he basically screamed, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He continued to yell that the enemy was using poisonous gas and they were using fire and they were literally killing people and destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple and terrifying warning. They're coming. Jose felt himself let out this yelp that he couldn't even control. He was so suddenly terrified. But he didn't even hear it because all around him, everybody else seemed to react basically the same way all at once. And the streets erupted in screaming and praying and just absolute chaos. Some people began pointing up to the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy. More and more people suddenly began flooding out onto the streets, crowding around the radios, trying to hear more information. They're all terrified and they don't know what's going on. Jose wanted to begin to tell these new people who were coming outside sort of what he and others had heard so far, but everybody out on the street was sort of talking over each other. It was just complete madness. And then literally on the radio, there's all these different voices coming over because clearly the news station is panicked and they can't even get a cohesive message out over this broadcast. However, despite this madness, the one word that kept coming through on the radio that everybody heard was "Go hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide." And Jose and some other people around him were thinking about doing just that when finally a new voice took over the broadcast. And this man was louder and more authoritative than the others, and it sort of immediately projected calm, not just clearly calm on the other end on the broadcast side, but it sort of quelled the crowd for a second. This person sounded like an authority figure, and this person introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. And he said that yes, there are cities around Quito that are currently under attack, but he said he had clear direction that he wanted everybody in Quito to follow. But despite this instruction really being the first kind of clear next steps for people to follow, it didn't make Jose feel any better about this. because the mayor told the people of Quito that the women and children, they had to flee, go hide, go away, go find somewhere safe. But the men had to stay and fight. Jose felt this rush of adrenaline because he's thinking, am I old enough to be considered, one of the men? Will I be expected to fight, or are they going to tell me to go flee with the women and kids? Like, he didn't really know, but he had this calming thought. He's like, you know what? We're at war and I am going to fight. So he signaled to his friends, sort of saying, all right, let's go, let's get ready here. And the group came together and they left the restaurant. And at that exact same second, a car came flying past on the street, narrowly missing Jose and his friends. And Jose saw it screech around the corner and out of sight before he heard this loud bang and the crunch of metal against stone. Immediately, some men ran after this car because clearly it had gotten into an accident and they need to go if they need help. But other people started running in the opposite direction. And so for Jose and his friends, it's like, what do we do? Do we go help with the car crash, or do we go, head to the front lines or something? At the same time, women were running by, clutching children, and Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble on past, grimacing as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, along with the rapid pounding of boots on cobblestones as people basically ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way he should go and what he and his friends should actually do here when he heard a news speaker's voice come on the radio, who announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically like the person who controls the security of the entire country of Ecuador. And the Minister of Government said to forget about what the mayor had told them about fighting the enemy, because Ecuador's weapons were literally not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. This is what the minister said. He basically said, we're going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was this very fast-talking man who said he was actually reporting live on the ground in Quito. Then he screamed out over the broadcast for everyone to run. And then his feed abruptly cut out. And then the original announcer came back on, and his voice shook as he said that reporter who had just said for everybody to run had just been killed. It was 9:21 p.m. 21 minutes had elapsed since this broadcast first went over the air, announcing this invasion of Ecuador. And in that time, it was like the country had spiraled into absolute madness. Now, remember, at this point, Jose is gathered with his friends. He's sort of begun to leave the restaurant, but so many things have happened all around him that he and his friends are just kind of standing there near the restaurant, not really sure what to do. And as they're standing there, Jose noticed that all these people who previously had just remained seated or remained near radios, it was like everybody all at once just got up and began running in different directions, running to the churches, running to their homes. It was like the entire country truly was just in full-blown panic mode. Jose also began to notice families come running out of their homes, dragging suitcases and belongings with them, getting ready to, evacuate hopefully, but where could they even go? They're surrounded. And just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering, and he saw a few people over at the restaurant's bar taking liquor from the shelves and pouring themselves drinks before tossing the bottles on the floor. Jose looked and realized his friends had already left him, so he's just standing here all alone. And he knew by this point he can't just keep standing here thinking about what he's going to do. He needs to do something. He needs to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life, and once again there was a voice calling out one final update. But it was so crazy all around him, Jose couldn't understand what this final update actually was. He just didn't hear it. However, Jose could clearly see other people around him had heard this final update, and they were obviously reacting to it because they stopped. Everybody stopped running around. They put down their suitcases, and everyone just kind of stood there. And then people began going for their guns and knives and torches. And then, once this huge, now armed crowd came together, they began to move as one, all in the direction of the city center. In the city center, in the Radio Quito station, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update, the one that Jose had not heard but others had and clearly reacted to. A minute later, Leonardo heard glass shattering somewhere one floor below him, along with a loud crackling sound. Then he smelled smoke, and he noticed the air in front of him inside the studio was getting hazy. And then from outside the building, he heard somebody yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, the anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on air to anybody who was listening that the radio station was in trouble and to please come help. But there really was no one left to help them. They were on their own. And when Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out of this station by themselves. And so they ran together down the stairs to the exit. But before they even got to the bottom of the steps, the smoke from the fire became so thick they couldn't even breathe. Leonardo realized that the whole first floor must be engulfed in flames. And so the only way out was actually to go up, not down. So Leonardo led the group back up the way they came, running back through the second floor office building, the studio space, where they had recorded the broadcast, and headed up the stairs to the very top floor. And by the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear screams coming from somewhere below him, and they sounded painful and horrible. He hoped his coworkers had been able to follow him up here, but by this point there was so much smoke in the building, he really couldn't see, so he didn't know who was here with him and who had been left behind. And also the roar of the fire was getting louder by the minute, and it was so hot that sweat poured from Leonardo's face and it stung his eyes. And so Leonardo instinctively ran away from the smoke towards the windows. And because they're on the top floor, 3 floors up, looking out, he had a good view of the ground below. And he saw these huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches and seemed to be running around in random patterns while big military tanks rolled in behind them, along with this hazy mist from some kind of gas kind of flowing across the entire crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake, and he frantically began to think, how am I going to get out of here? I need to escape. And that's when he saw the roof next door. So the radio station sat next door to a school, which was at this point not yet on fire. Now, the school building was not connected to the radio station, but it was close enough that Leonardo realized that he might be able to open up a window that he's standing right near, get a running start, and literally jump out the window and land on the school roof. Now, obviously, if he undershot this jump, he would fall to the street below and die, but the alternative was stay here and be burned alive. So Leonardo just opened up the window, he backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and jumped out the window. He flew into the air, arms flailing as he willed himself to land on the school roof, and after a millisecond in the air, he comes crashing down, slams onto the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste here, nor did he really have time to wait to see if others would also make this jump. He really felt like he's sort of on his own here. And so up he got, and despite the pain from impacting the roof, he was basically okay. And he walked across the school building until he went to the next roof. Basically, the next building butted up against the school building. So he climbs onto that roof, and he walks across that roof until he reaches the next building. Again, these buildings are all connected, so there's no more jumping from, one building to the next, but he is going roof to roof, basically high up above the streets of Quito. And down below, he sees, all this madness with the tanks and all these people with torches. He doesn't really know what's going on here. And eventually, he reaches a roof, as he makes his way, that a family was sitting on. And the family, they were looking out at the city, where the sky was still glowing from the light of the fire Leonardo had just escaped from. And when they saw Leonardo, they told him they had actually been down on the streets in that crowd. But when it became too dangerous, they had come up here to escape. And they asked Leonardo, had he done the same thing? Is that why he was here? Leonardo said no. And then he told them who he was and how he actually arrived here and why, and then he asked them for help. And for a second, the family just stared at him in shock. But then they began to talk to each other, and from what Leonardo could hear, and also based on facial expressions, the family seemed mad. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. However, there was a condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he, Leonardo, go down on the street with that crowd. The father said Leonardo would have to hide out in this family's house because, the father explained, that everybody in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out Leonardo's broadcast had actually been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he hoped it would do. It grabbed the attention of basically everybody in Quito. The whole city stopped in its tracks to listen to what the broadcast had to say. However, there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided Not to mention in this broadcast until the very end, when in many ways it was already too late. This fact was the final update, the one Jose had not been able to hear, but that had caused everybody on the street who had heard it to stop running around, stop screaming, and just get their guns, knives, and torches and head towards the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was this whole broadcast was a farce. The invasion was not real. It was an act, a prank, a joke. The broadcast was like this play. It was an adaptation of a fiction novel called War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. And so what Leonardo did is he orchestrated this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news broadcast about an alien invasion. The exact same thing had actually been done in the United States a few years earlier in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was not real, and it still caused mass panic, even though they had been warned. And so, during Leonardo's broadcast, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not, soothed. They were not like, oh boy, what a great prank. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they went to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his broadcast crew were, and they lit it on fire. And so between the radio station fire and also between all the people who took their own lives preemptively, believing aliens were going to be here any minute to kill them, torture them, abduct them, the death toll from this night, from this farce, was between 6 and 20 people. And a whole lot more people were also injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive, and later in life, he would actually give a tell-all interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he didn't face any criminal charges, no jail time, nothing. But this whole incident really destroyed his credibility, and it made people not trust him in Ecuador. So it was basically impossible to get work. And so eventually he had to move to Venezuela. And then as for Radio Quito, the at one point very influential, very important news broadcast, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after this incident. On the evening of Sunday, January 26, 1851, a 23-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath. But despite the weather, he could not stop smiling. And that was because he was about to do something that he loved to do that made him a lot of money, and it was actually the 3rd time that day that he was even doing it. I mean, this was awesome. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. So at this point in America, in 1851, there was this phenomenon going on called the spiritualist movement. Basically, huge numbers of people began to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through mediums like Bailey's. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums like Bailey's conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table along with all their guests that were going to participate, and they would summon spirits. And what would happen is the participants in these seances could literally tell when it was that the spirit actually made contact with the medium. Because the round table they were all sitting at would shake or move. Sometimes the table would thump so violently that one of the legs of the table would break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a huge success. So seances were a craze all over the country. And many people did genuinely believe that, people like Bailey's, mediums, could talk to ghosts in these seances. But there were lots of people also who didn't believe any of it, thought it was completely made up, but they would still hire people like Bailey's to have these seances at parties and other functions as sort of a form of entertainment, kind of like how you might hire a band or a magician. And in Fall River, Massachusetts, there really was a big appetite for these seances, both because people believed they were true and lots of people who thought they were fake. And it's in part because there were lots of homes in Fall River, Massachusetts at the time that sort of had some history about being haunted, and so there was sort of groundwork laid for both believers and non-believers to contract people like Bailey's. Now, to be clear, Bailey's whole seance act was a blatant fake. In fact, many of the people who hired Bailey's knew in advance that it was all an act, that Bailey's really was more of a performer than a psychic medium. But Bailey's was really good at faking it, and so he had become kind of like the go-to medium, certainly in Fall River, which meant for him to maintain this flow of business, he really had to put full energy into every performance to keep getting people to call on him. So on this day, as Bailey's is sitting there getting ready to start his third seance of the day, he was tired. I mean, it's pretty exhausting to do these performances, but he knew he just had to get that second wind and just push through and do as good of a job as he possibly could. And so as the homeowner of this third seance opened up the door and let him inside, Bailey's was sure this was going to be at least as good, if not better, than the other performances of the day. Moments later, the homeowner, John Gardner, led Bailey's into the living room where several other guests were already gathered. Bailey's immediately snapped into character. He swooshed his cape as he walked in, and he waved his hand around the room to command their attention. And when everyone turned to look at him, he said, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped, and Bailey's could tell they were going to be a very enthusiastic audience, which always made these seances much more fun. So into the parlor they all went, and they all took a seat around this big circular table in the middle of the room. And then Bailey's dimmed the lights and walked around the table giving his instructions. He then told them to all hover their hands over the table with their palms down and their fingers spread, and that each of them would have to touch the hands of the person sitting next to them. He told them that once they were all touching, it would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. And so once all of his guests got into position with their hands, Bailey's took his seat and did the same thing with his own hands, creating a full circuit all the way around the table. And at that point, everybody was ready. And so he nodded, and in a commanding voice, he said that now he was going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move this table. The room got deadly quiet as everyone waited to see what Bailey's would do. But Bailey's just let the tension grow, because he knew that the longer he waited, the more anticipation would build. This was actually Bailey's favorite part of the performance, and he could feel his own heart begin to race. I mean, this really was exciting. But then finally, he broke the silence and called out to the spirits in the room and demanded that if there were a ghost here, to make itself known. And at this, everyone immediately began to look around excitedly, which created the quick distraction that Bailey's actually needed to perform his first trick. So mediums used a few different tools to help them fake communication from these ghosts, and one of those tools were these special hooks that they actually attached to their wrists, and they hid them under their sleeves. And then when they put their hands palm down, hovering over the table like they told everybody else to do, those hooks would actually go below the table and grip on, so the medium could, without looking like they're actually touching the table, literally lift the table up and rattle it around, again, without appearing to actually touch it. Now, it actually took a lot of strength to do this. I mean, imagine moving a huge table around just like with your arms kind of hovering over the table. But Bailey's was getting really good at it. And so as his guests were all looking around, looking out for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks right under the table and began moving his wrists around, which caused the table to thump. And as soon as this happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed, and the other guests began laughing and getting really excited. But Bailey's was only just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time, and as he did, he literally made the table rise off the floor as all the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was even doing this. I mean, he knew this was fake, but how are you lifting the table up? Because his hands are over the table, remember. It's just these secret hooks underneath. But Bailey's just kind of ignored the man and smiled. And then he said to the spirit that if you're willing to communicate with us, rap on this table one time. And then Bailey's used the hook, underneath the table to make a knocking sound. And as he did this, the woman who had first screamed on the other side of the table, she jumped. She was so scared. And it actually caused Bailey's to have this surge of adrenaline, like he was really doing a good job. And so Bailey's actually kind of leaned into this and rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. And in doing this, Bailey's was really exerting himself. He's trying not to give off the vibe that he's moving this table around, but he really is. And so he's sweating bullets, and he's also yelling out to the spirit, demanding them to come forward and talk to us. But then, as Bailey's is doing this big act here that he in no way suspects is going to actually call spirits into the room, he suddenly felt the room turn icy cold, and he had this weird tingling sensation flowing through him. He blinked, and then his vision got hazy. This had never happened to him during any of his seances. And clearly, it was having an effect on him because he no longer was trying to communicate with the dead. He was just kind of standing there, very uneasy, like this seance was actually doing something, that there really might be spirits in the room. Now, Bailey's can tell he's getting stared at, and he doesn't want to destroy his business here, like he needs to maintain the act. He can't just spook himself out and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't break out of this weird feeling he had. The room felt so cold. I mean, something was off here. And then he tried to move, and it was like he couldn't. He was frozen. Now, at the same time Bailey's is experiencing this, across the table, the homeowner and host, John Gardner, is just sitting there staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what's actually happening here. And from his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from sort of standing there awkwardly, unable to move, it looked like, to then sitting down in his chair and sort of lurching back in this awkward position. And then Bailey's eyes began darting all over the room, and also his breathing got really ragged and heavy. And John couldn't help but feel like it looks like Bailey's is possessed for real. And then Bailey's began to speak, and his voice sort of cracked as he did, and he began mumbling something that John and the others couldn't understand. I mean, John, he really couldn't help it. He felt sort of spooked by this. I mean, this was really convincing. John actually wanted to applaud. I mean, Bailey's acting was so good here. But he also didn't want to destroy the act and sort of break his character. You know, like Bailey's, John and most of his guests did not believe seances were real at all. But, I mean, Bailey's performance was really turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair, and the whole table thumped again and shook, and then Bailey's let out this almost ghostly sounding moan, and then one of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. But instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head, so only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. I mean, this was just incredible, like really kind of scary stuff here. But then Bailey's let out another moan and then fell backwards hard onto the ground. And for a second, there was just confused silence. Because if this is an act, I mean, that was a violent fall. This looks really legitimate. How is Bailey's able to do this over and over again? This seems real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something is off here that some of the guests began to scream and they began to run out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He'd been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and actually ran out and gotten him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of problem he was actually responding to. But now he could see there was a group of people dressed for a party gathered around what appeared to be a seance table, pointing to the floor, where there was this young man lying in a crumpled heap. Dr. Harper went to the young man and reached out and felt the man's neck, but there was no pulse. And so the doctor turned and looked at the group and said, "He's dead." And before the group could really even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on. Someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward and now in a very shaking voice explained that this young man was a medium whose name was Bailey Staples. And he had been doing a seance and he had demanded a ghost talk to the group. And then a moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought this seance was a fake. I mean, when they hired Bailey's, they literally thought this was just going to be a performance, nothing real. But now, I mean, they didn't know what to think. This looked very real. Dr. Hopper shook his head, not really sure what to make of this explanation. He certainly did not believe in ghosts, but after a quick examination of Bailey's, he really couldn't see any obvious cause for the medium's death. So Dr. Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that, whatever killed Bailey Staples was not a ghost, but he didn't know what it was yet. However, he would get to the bottom of it. However, by the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond, and it made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to do to figure out what happened to him basically impossible. Now, the reason it was impossible is because some people were claiming that this was a ghost that possessed Bailey's, but it didn't actually kill him. The ghost must have put Bailey's into a trance where he appears dead, but is not actually dead. But if Dr. Hopper performs the autopsy on him, the autopsy will kill Bailey's, so you can't do that. And so pretty quickly, you have all these people that are showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and the local police station demanding authorities give them Bailey's body to prevent the doctor from killing him by doing an autopsy on him. And so it's this whole scene. And at the same time, keep in mind, the country as a whole has been taken with seances. That was already something that was sort of happening everywhere. But this story, which sort of legitimized the idea that ghosts could be real and ghosts can also be dangerous given what happened to Bailey's, this story is spreading like wildfire all over the country. And so at a time where people in America were already big on seances, this pretty much dumped gasoline on that, and seances became even more popular, but now because they felt real, not because they were entertainment. On January 28th, so 2 days after Bailey's was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead and conduct his autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. And now he was looking down at Bailey's body, realizing that, to his own surprise, he was sort of nervous about this. Like the idea that, what if this guy's actually still alive and I'm about to kill him with this autopsy? Now, logically, the doctor did not think Bailey's was in a trance, but it was unsettling how physically healthy Bailey's body looked. He was young and strong with no history of illness, and there wasn't a mark on his body anywhere to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were these slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper understood were from the special hooks he had been wearing when he died to lift up the table. But Dr. Hopper shook off the nerves and moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bailey's chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out, on the day Bailey Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak as he lifted John Gardner's table up off the ground and made the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Bailey's didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bailey's had a pre-existing heart condition, and his passionate performance, coupled with the physical exertion it took to lift up that heavy parlor table with just his wrists, and the fact that Bailey's had also already given 2 other similar performances that day, caused his weak heart to swell and develop an aneurysm which ruptured and caused fatal internal bleeding. Bailey Staples had basically put on the absolute best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him, and also accidentally convinced an entire house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real. On the night of May 3rd, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and just listened really intently to figure out, where the sound is coming from. But she just couldn't do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house, and at one point it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. It really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint, and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house. But then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it's 2, 3 in the morning, and it's just silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well, clearly it was some animal, or maybe it's a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. She's rationalizing the sound. It's gone now, so it can't be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing this sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary, she was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away tragically 11 years earlier in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of, his death. This is something that they really had never been able to move past. And so as Mary is laying here in bed and she's hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks maybe it's Cora, maybe she's doing something. But really what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt and how badly she missed her husband. Like she really just wished he was here, because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate. I'm gonna stay here. You go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He'd been gone for over a decade. And so eventually, even though Mary really didn't want to get up and go look for this tapping sound, because truthfully, she was just scared at this point, but she's thinking about her daughter, Cora, who's downstairs, and heaven forbid there's some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house and it could be hazardous. She doesn't know. So she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter's okay. And on top of that, her daughter, Cora, had recently had this really bad case of strep throat. And while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, this is an opportunity as much as anything to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she's okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage and she takes her sheets off and she gets up out of her bed. And at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It's all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she's out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door and there's nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she's looking out, but there's nothing. And the house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It's like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what? The sound has stopped. Everything's okay. I'm sure Cora's okay. I'm getting back in bed and I'm going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed. She did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled him up to her chin, and just hoped the sound wouldn't come back. And it didn't. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately kind of took stock and realized, okay, I'm okay. Everything seems fine in the house. She listened and didn't hear any knocking sounds. And she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits. And so Mary just kind of, breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign, but there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat, and then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she didn't really even know what they meant. She was kind of spooked by it, didn't want to scare her daughter, so it never came up. But they're chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there's very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen, in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the same sounds she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora as well is looking at her mom like, did you hear that? And Mary's like, you heard that too? You heard that tapping? And Cora's like, yeah, I think it's coming from the cellar. And Mary, she's like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, well, it sounds like it's in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they're rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is. And so Mary, who at this point is desperate to find a logical, non-scary explanation for what's going on here, just immediately goes down the stairs into the cellar and begins looking for mice that would prove that's all this is. It's mice making these sounds. But when she's down there, she's looking around and there's no mice, there's no sign of mice. And as she's down there, she starts hearing the tapping again. But now it's not coming from the cellar where they thought the sounds were originating. It's coming from somewhere above her. And as soon as Mary hears this tapping sound, she hears Cora reacting to it upstairs in the kitchen, like she was kind of startled by it. And so Mary runs back upstairs to the kitchen. She looks at Cora, and Cora is visibly distressed because she's like, I heard it. It was in here. It was in the kitchen or somewhere nearby. I didn't see anything, but I heard it. As soon as you went down there, I heard it. And so at this point, Mary is undeniably scared. She doesn't know what this is, but it's gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so Mary said, you know what? I'm going next door. They had a friend who lived next door, a guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door. And when he came, she explained that there's something happening. There's knocking sounds happening in my house. It's scaring me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, absolutely, I'll be over in a second. And so Mary goes back to her house and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen, and periodically they're hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over. He comes inside, and right away, when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary's like, what is that? And Cora, she's totally spooked. And the guy's like, I think it's your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is. And so Mary and Cora, they're like, great. Like, he seems pretty confident that that's all this is. And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he's checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he's checking all these different areas that as he's checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it's not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he's working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, when the tapping got really loud, and it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing, because it's nowhere near here, it's behind us. And the man, he turned around and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face is ashen, he really looked pretty upset. And he said, the last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they couldn't get out. And they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like. After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so Mary and Cora, they're left wondering, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she couldn't believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. I mean, he knows she's grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she's thinking about what he told her. That it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if these are ghosts? What if it's my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago trying to get my attention? What if they're trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued. And the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they'd come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house. And sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they'd all hear the tapping sounds, and nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers, people are talking about it all over the place, and in some ways that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight, but they also really didn't know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they're sitting at the table weighing out their options. What do we even do? Even if this is, our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we can't live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on and on, do we eventually move? And so they're having that kind of discussion. And as they're sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It's practically on top of Mary and Cora, so much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started. And they both kind of looked at each other like, It's right on top of us. What's going on? And then as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of, the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she's sitting back, she saw something she had never noticed before. And immediately she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat, and she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as synonyms chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And synonyms chorea has a very different set of symptoms to strep throat. This condition, which is also known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly and not even know they're doing it. And so what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound, but had no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by synonyms chorea. Now, it seems like, well, how didn't Mary catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times Mary was not in the same room as her daughter. And her daughter did not know she was making the tapping sounds. So her daughter is genuinely scared of the tapping sounds because she doesn't know she's making them. And Mary doesn't know it's her daughter making them. And so combined, they're like, oh my gosh, what's happening in our house? And then before long, they had kind of gone down this path of, it's my dead husband, it's my dead father, he's the one making these sounds. And then it's like they had tunnel vision, as did all the other neighbors, as did the reporters. Everybody wanted this in some ways to be a haunting. And so nobody's checking to see if maybe Cora is tapping her feet or hands and creating these tapping sounds, because again, Cora was fully convinced she was not making those sounds. But then finally, when she and her mom were sitting at the table discussing what they were gonna do 6 days after the haunting began, and they hear this really intense, close tapping sound, when Mary kind of leaned back to kind of take stock of the room and figure out what was going on, she noticed under the table Cora's foot stomping on the ground. Cora didn't know it was synonyms chorea. One afternoon in November of 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Petit was on break at her job in the city of Decatur, Alabama. And while she was sitting in the break room, she pulled out her phone and she called her 21-year-old daughter, Hannah. The phone rang a couple of times, but then eventually Hannah picked up, and right away, Nicole could tell her daughter, Hannah, was still very much not feeling well. She could hear it clearly in her voice. So Nicole's daughter was a stay-at-home mom to two very young kids, which, was totally exhausting in its own right. And in fact, on this phone call, Nicole could hear in the background the sound of the kids yelling and running around and crashing into things, so clearly it was just chaos over there. But Nicole knew Hannah could not just be tired from tending to her kids, because over the last couple of months, what Nicole had noticed was every time she spoke to her daughter, whether her daughter's kids were going crazy or not, Hannah just completely sounded under the weather. And in fact, Hannah often was complaining, again over the past few months, of not only feeling a deep exhaustion, but also of feeling really dizzy and nauseous. Now, over the past few months, Nicole had been telling her daughter, you have to go see a doctor. This is not normal. This is not just parenting fatigue. Something is off. You need to go get looked at. But Hannah, who was known to be very, very tough and, generally didn't really go to the doctor much, she said to her mom, I'm fine. I'm just exhausted from the kids. It's no big deal. And so she kind of pushed that idea aside. And so this time, as Nicole's talking to her daughter and she can clearly hear that her daughter is not better, she's still feeling awful, She knew trying to push her daughter to go see the doctor wasn't going to work. So instead, she said, okay, Hannah, when's Brian going to be home? Brian was Hannah's husband. And Hannah just sighed and she said, no, he's not home yet. I don't know when he's going to be here. So for the most part, Brian was, a very active parent and husband, but he also was a very successful chiropractor. And in fact, he had had so much success at his private practice that recently he'd even been able to fully renovate his building. And so with this new building and all this extra space and all this new staff, he was working even more than usual, which, financially was great for the family. But it meant he basically was absent all the time. And so it had become kind of commonplace that Brian was nowhere to be seen. It was kind of Hannah alone with the kids and this mystery illness she was suffering from. Now, Nicole obviously understood the nuance here. She knew that, Brian's practice was very important, not just to him, but to Hannah and their family. And so instead of, being upset with Brian, Nicole had tried very hard to make herself available to her daughter, to take care of her kids, to help her out whenever she could. But there was a limit to how much Nicole could help because Nicole also worked full time. And so she couldn't just be around all the time to help with her daughter. Like today, she was working. She wished she wasn't so she could go be with her daughter, but that was just the way it was. For the next couple of minutes, Nicole and Hannah just chatted like mother and daughter. And then at some point towards the end of the call, like Nicole always did, she told her daughter, like, hey, I really think you ought to go to the doctor. If you tell me what day you're gonna go and you make an appointment, I'll go over and take care of your kids. I'll even take you to the appointment, whatever you need. Don't let logistics be the reason you don't see a doctor. Like whatever you need, you let me know and I will help you if I can. I'll flex my schedule to accommodate yours. But like Hannah always did, she just kind of brushed off her mom and said, okay, maybe I'll go see a doctor. I don't know, but I think I'm gonna be fine. I'm gonna rest, I'm gonna take vitamins, I'm gonna eat well, I'm gonna do all the things, and I'm sure this will pass. Nicole sighed when she heard this because basically she hears her daughter saying, I'm not going to the doctor still. But Nicole didn't argue. She just told her daughter that she loved her and she would see her soon, and then the two hung up. Over the next few weeks, Hannah continued to feel completely awful, nauseous, dizzy. All of her symptoms persisted and in some ways even got worse. But no matter how much pressure was put on her, namely by her mom, to go see a doctor, Hannah didn't. She really had convinced herself that this was just, parenting fatigue and that she would just get through it and she would be fine, which again was sort of very much her personality. She was this tough, hard-charging woman. She was gonna just grit this one out. But then finally, in January of 2022, so now it's been months and months of Hannah having these symptoms and her mom basically begging her to go see a doctor. And by this point, Hannah can't argue with the fact that she is basically falling apart. She's lost so much weight, she actually can't even walk around her house anymore. She literally sits on a swivel chair, like a desk chair, and just pushes herself around the house. She is absolutely sick, and it's something that she can't even deny anymore. And so finally, in January of 2022, Hannah says, okay, Mom, I'll go to the hospital. Nicole, in some ways, was incredibly relieved that finally her daughter is doing the thing she should have done a long time ago. And then also, Nicole was just so annoyed with her daughter. Like, why didn't you go sooner? This is so silly. But regardless, Nicole's like, great. She tells her daughter, I'm gonna come over, pick you up, I'm gonna take you to the hospital, I'll be there with you. And so she goes over to Hannah's house, and when she gets there, Hannah in her chair wheels over to the door, and Hannah looks awful. She looks like she weighs less than 100 pounds, she's so pale, her hair looks like it's falling out. She looks absolutely sick. She looks like there's something seriously wrong with her. But Nicole, she just takes her daughter and assists her down the stairs, puts her in the car. She also gets her kids and brings them along as well, and they drive to the hospital. And when they get there, eventually Hannah is brought into an exam room along with Nicole and the kids, and a nurse comes in and they begin checking Hannah's vital signs and asking her some questions, and they also weighed Hannah. And eventually, after that was done, the nurse told Hannah that, hey, you only weigh 84 pounds. This is way below what's considered healthy. This is like an emergency. And based on the other things you're telling me about over the last few months having these symptoms, I'm worried you might actually have stomach cancer. Now, even though Nicole had anticipated that something seriously was wrong with her daughter, it still hit her like a freight train to hear that her 21-year-old daughter had stomach cancer. She'd never even heard of somebody that young having stomach cancer. And when Nicole looked over at her daughter, Hannah too was horrified. For her, she still believed this was all just gonna pass. Whatever this is, it'll go away. But obviously, stomach cancer is not something that just goes away. A couple minutes later, a doctor came in the room and explained to Hannah and Nicole that the next step here was to test Hannah to see if she actually had stomach cancer. Now, the doctor said it was entirely possible this could be something else, but again, based on all the symptoms you've described and the sudden extreme weight loss, unfortunately, this really does appear to be stomach cancer. But we're gonna check, and in a couple of days, we should have an answer. And so Nicole and Hannah, despite obviously being shocked and scared, they both said, whatever we need to do, that's what we're gonna do. A few days later, Nicole was at home when her phone rang, and it was her daughter calling. Now, to this point, Hannah had gone in and begun doing some of the tests to see if she had stomach cancer, and they were waiting for some of the results to come back. And so when Nicole saw this call coming in, she's thinking, oh my goodness, this could be it. I could be getting the call where Hannah has been told one way or the other about this being stomach cancer. And so with quite a bit of anxiety, Nicole answered the phone. And when she heard her daughter was not telling her about test results. Her daughter, she was speaking in such a low tone that she could barely hear her, but she basically croaked out to her mother that she felt so sick, she had to be taken to the hospital right now. And so Nicole, she dropped everything, sped over to her daughter's house. And when she found Hannah inside, it was like Hannah could barely move. She was so fatigued. She was so sick, so pale, so skinny and malnourished. It was like her daughter was dying. And so she scooped her daughter up and she rushed her to the hospital. Later that day, Hannah was in a hospital room and was stabilized. When she had come in, she actually was showing signs of what's called acute respiratory failure, which basically meant her lungs were shutting down. And in fact, one of her doctors had told Nicole that had Nicole not gone over there and rushed her daughter to the hospital on that day, very likely she would have died. She would not have survived another 24 hours at home. So this was as close as you can come to, your daughter dying. But they had been able to stabilize Hannah, and she was now resting in bed, and they were now trying to figure out what to do. And one of the doctors pulled Nicole aside and said, look, we know she's being tested for stomach cancer, and we don't know if she has that or not yet. But acute respiratory failure is not connected to stomach cancer. And on top of that, it's incredibly rare for someone as young as Hannah. So we really don't know what's going on here. All we can do is keep her here, keep her stable, monitor her, and run some additional tests. And so Nicole, she said, okay, let's do it. And so for a few days, that's what the medical staff did. They just continued to monitor and keep Hannah stable while testing her to figure out how somebody her age and in her condition could be contracting respiratory failure. But after a few days of this, out of nowhere, Hannah has this severe sudden seizure. But after her seizure passed, the medical staff began investigating Hannah's brain because a seizure is a brain-related event. And as they're looking into Hannah's brain, they discover that she has also contracted viral meningitis, which is inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. And generally speaking, viral meningitis is not life-threatening, but in rare cases, it can be. And considering the fact that Hannah had other very serious medical issues going on, and the fact that her particular viral meningitis case was very severe, doctors were worried that she could be someone who could die from this meningitis, or potentially have very serious brain damage if they didn't do something drastic to combat this swelling in her brain. And so a decision was made to put Hannah into a medically induced coma so that she would lay perfectly still and they could just wait for the swelling in her brain to go down. But what that meant functionally was that Hannah would be in this coma indefinitely until, the swelling goes down in her brain or who knows what. I mean, basically the doctors didn't know what was going on with her. However, just a couple of days after Hannah had been placed in this medically induced coma, some of her imaging tests came back from all the testing they had run on Hannah to try to figure out what was going on here. And in particular, there were these imaging tests that came back from her abdomen. They had scanned her abdomen. And what they discovered inside of her abdomen was truly shocking. Hannah's entire digestive tract was covered in white spots. And the doctors all knew that those spots were not cancer. They were something worse. And after running a few more tests to confirm their theory, once they had that information that, yep, what we suspect is going on here, they called the police. So remember Hannah's husband, Brian? He's the very successful chiropractor. Well, his practice had been so successful that he had had the funds to fully renovate his office and build this bigger, better chiropractic practice. And that was great, not just for him, but also for Hannah, her whole family. They were making money hand over fist. Everything was great. Except there was an issue. One of the upgrades that Brian wanted to do within this renovated space was to include an X-ray room. And when people build X-ray rooms, they actually line the walls of the room with these big sheets of lead to keep the radiation from penetrating the walls. But lead is incredibly toxic and harmful to humans, especially if you ingest it or you touch it. It's not something you really want to interact with at all. It needs to be kept at a safe distance. But after the renovations were done and the X-ray room was built, there were several sheets of lead that didn't make it into the walls. They were sort of extra sheets of lead that just didn't get used, and they were out in the open. And when police discovered that and they began investigating, they found somebody had been shaving off pieces of those extra lead sheets, little bits of lead. They were shaving them off and planting them inside of Hannah's vitamins that she took religiously every day, believing those were the things that were gonna make her healthy again. But in reality, sort of ironically, they were doing the opposite. She was literally poisoning herself every time she took one of those vitamins. And who was the person who was shaving off all that lead and literally trying to kill Hannah? Her own husband, Brian. All those white spots inside of Hannah's digestive tract were literally just pools of lead that had accumulated inside of her because her husband had been trying to poison her to death for months. Miraculously though, Hannah would survive. After nearly 2 months in a medically induced coma, Hannah was healthy enough to be woken up and got to go back home with her kids. As for Brian, he was arrested, found guilty of attempted murder, and sentenced to life in prison. His motive was the $1.3 million in life insurance policies that he had taken out on Hannah. At 4:45 a.m. on Saturday, January 17, 2015, a 27-year-old farmer named Caleb Whitby drove his pickup truck down a highway in southeastern Oregon. Caleb knew conditions for driving were not great. In fact, they were kind of awful. The road was icy, it was foggy out, the sun wasn't up, so it was pretty dark out. But he felt like he didn't really have a choice. He had to go pick up a shipment of cattle for his family's farm. After driving for another 10 minutes or so down this road, so it's just before 5 a.m. at this point, Caleb found himself right behind this big semi-truck who was going under the speed limit. And so Caleb's cruising along here, getting frustrated, and he's thinking about passing the truck. But when he kind of peeked around the side and looked up ahead of the truck, he saw there was a very sharp turn coming up, and he didn't really have enough runway to make the pass, at least not safely. And so Caleb just kind of throttled back and decided he would make the pass after making the turn. And so the semi-truck, which is right in front of Caleb, it ends up making this turn and gets out of sight of Caleb. And then a moment later, Caleb makes the same turn, and as soon as he does, he sees something that he couldn't have seen before. He's seeing it right now that sends a jolt of panic through his body, and reflexively, he jams on his brakes, he loses control of his truck, it starts to slide, and all Caleb can do is just brace and pray that he doesn't get killed. And then a second later, he heard a loud crunching sound, and then his truck stalled, and everything went quiet. But the silence was broken when suddenly there was another crunching sound, and at the same time, Caleb suddenly felt his lungs getting crushed together, and all the air was just pulled out of his body. Moments later, a different semi-truck driver was going down the same stretch of highway that Caleb had been, and he rounded that exact same turn, and when he did, he saw the same thing that had horrified Caleb and caused him to swerve out of control. Except this semi-truck driver, when he hit his brakes, he was able to basically maintain his truck, and he sort of gently hit the guardrail and, crashed, but it didn't cause any damage to him or really to his truck. And so after kind of composing himself, this semi-truck driver got out of the cabin and he looked out at this unbelievably horrific scene in front of him, and instinctively he knew if he goes forward and inspects this, he's just gonna see dead bodies, and he didn't know if he could even handle that. And so he's just standing there in utter shock when he hears this sound, and he knows this sound is something that he has to go investigate. And so even though he was terrified of, potentially seeing dead people, he walked towards the sound, and suddenly he saw where it was coming from, and he just couldn't believe what he was looking at. It would turn out when Caleb Whitby rounded that corner and then saw this horrible thing that caused him to crash,
Well, what he saw was a massive pileup of over 24 cars just completely blocking the road. And so he smashed on his brakes and he tried to stop himself, but ultimately he smashed into the semi-truck that just moments before he had been driving behind. The semi-truck had also crashed. And so Caleb has now crashed into the side of the semi, and everything's silent for a second. And then another semi-truck comes around the corner. Caleb can't go anywhere, and that semi-truck blasted into the back of Caleb's car. After that, the other semi-truck, the third semi-truck, if you will, rounds the corner, sees the pileup, hits the brakes, but this guy, he manages to crash into the guardrail, avoiding major injury and damage to his truck. And so he gets out of his truck, and he's surveying this horrific scene, and he hears a sound. And he follows that sound right into the crash, and eventually he finds it. And that sound was Caleb. Here is a picture that this driver took of Caleb, of what he found when he found Caleb. It's unbelievable. Somehow, when Caleb's truck was smashed from both directions, it created this perfect pocket of space just big enough for Caleb to fit inside of. And so despite being smashed together by two semi-trucks in this huge pileup, Caleb was basically unhurt. And so when this third semi-truck driver found Caleb, he actually was able to, after taking this photo, pull Caleb out of the wreckage, and minus a bruise and a couple of cuts on his face, Caleb actually was just fine and ultimately walked away. And in fact, after first responders showed up and cleared the wreck, it would turn out that incredibly, nobody was killed.
As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my flagship podcast, the Mrballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. And in addition to that podcast, we over at Ballen Studios actually have a whole slate of other incredible strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts for you to enjoy. If you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, check out my other podcast I host called Mrballen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear somebody else from Ballen Studios with a far better radio voice tell you a story, like Luke LaManna. Luke has two podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. One is called Wartime Stories, which sort of mirrors what he does on YouTube, also called Wartime Stories. It's like the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield. And he also has a show called Redacted. It's brand new, and it delves into government conspiracies and cover-ups. It's wild. Ballen Studios also has shows that are just pure nightmare fuel, like Bedtime Stories with host Richard Weil, who looks into cryptid encounters, supernatural deaths, the paranormal, and everything in between. It's really good. And then of course, we have Run Fool, hosted by the iconic Rodney Barnes, who's like a true pioneer in the horror space. We were so lucky to be able to collaborate with him, and his show, which sort of delves into terrifying folklore, is just one of a kind. You gotta check it out. So if any of these shows appeal to you, make sure you go check them out by just going to any podcast platform and looking up Ballen Studios, and boom, you'll see all of our shows. Make sure you follow along and tune in each week for new episodes. One of the most insane jobs in the world is being a saturation diver for an oil and gas company. These highly specialized divers go down to extreme depths to do construction and demolition on underwater structures. The extreme pressure on their bodies from being so deep will cause some of the mixed gas they breathe to get trapped inside of their body. Now, this is harmless while it's happening, so while they're down at depth, this doesn't matter. But when they ascend, they have to do what's called decompression stops, where they basically stop in the water column at certain depths and just wait and allow these trapped gases to naturally come out of their body. Now, if they skip these decompression stops and just rush to the surface, those trapped gases will not leave their body and they will expand inside of them, causing a condition called decompression sickness, or the bends, and it can be fatal. Now, these decompression stops get longer and longer the deeper you go. And in the case of saturation divers, they'll go as deep as 2,000 feet. And for reference, in order to safely ascend from 2,000 feet, it would take you about 33 hours. And so these oil and gas companies can't afford to have their divers taking 33 hours in between dives, and so they came up with a clever workaround. They built a pressurized chamber system on board ships and oil rigs where their divers would live in between their dives. And what this did was, by keeping their divers constantly under pressure, either literally underwater or in this system, the trapped gases inside of them didn't have a chance to expand, and so their divers couldn't get the bends. The divers would live inside of this incredibly cramped chamber for weeks at a time, getting transported to and from the seafloor inside of this small pressurized sphere that's called a dive bell that could detach from the chamber without totally depressurizing the whole system. At the end of these divers' multi-week shifts, they would do one long decompression stop inside of the chamber. And then when they were done, they'd step out of the chamber and they'd be fine again. In September of 2012, a 32-year-old saturation diver named Chris Lemons was on board a dive ship in the middle of the North Sea. He, along with 11 other divers, had just started a 4-week-long saturation shift. On the 12th of that month, Chris, along with 2 other divers named Dave and Duncan, were scheduled to perform routine maintenance on an oil platform 330 feet below the surface. The North Sea is notorious for terrible weather, but this day the weather was especially bad, and they considered not doing the dive, but ultimately they decided to do it anyways. As Chris, Dave, and Duncan put on their diving equipment and climbed from their living chamber through the tunnel into the dive bell, the captain of the ship navigated directly over this oil platform and then flipped on autopilot mode, which activated dynamic positioning. Now, dive ships rely heavily on dynamic positioning, which is really just this high-tech computer that makes sure, as soon as you turn it on, that the ship does not move from a particular spot in the water. So regardless of the swells and the wind, the ship stays steady. And this is really important when you have divers in the water, because the dive bell is connected to the ship and the divers are connected to the dive bell. And so if the ship is moving all over the place, so is the dive bell, and so are the divers, making it impossible for the divers to do their job. Once the captain had the dynamic positioning up and running, the 3 divers sealed the door of the dive bell behind them, and then the dive bell was detached from the chamber and then lowered through a hole in the middle of the ship into the ocean. Once the bell got down to 330 feet, Chris opened up a hatch on the bottom of the dive bell that led directly into the water. Now, because the pressure inside the bell matches the pressure outside the bell, water does not come in through this hole. Duncan was the bellman for the night, so he would not be going out and doing any diving. He would be staying in the bell to support Dave and Chris. And so he helped them get their big helmets on and connected their umbilical to each of them. Sat divers, when they're outside of the bell, are completely reliant on their umbilical. It's this long stretch of tubes and wires that are connected directly to their suit and to their helmet, and it provides air as well as heat and electricity to their lights, and it provides radio communication up to the people on the boat. Once Chris and Dave were all set up, they slipped through the hole at the bottom of the bell, which brought them down to this little platform that was suspended right below the bell, and from there they leapt off all the way down to the sea floor. Now, sat divers will say that leap from that platform is both amazing and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong on the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting in the rough seas, dragging with it the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped on the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice that this was no drill, this was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. they needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up to the bell. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilical was getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top, and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, "There is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free." And Chris would say, "I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon." And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off. And what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on. However, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and totally, completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware that even if they're looking for him, they're not going to find him in time. He's going to die. And at some point, breathing would have become extremely difficult until there was no more air, and then he would have passed out and keeled over. Back on the surface, the captain was desperately trying to use manual controls to pilot the ship back over where Chris was, but because of how rough the seas were, it was proving to be nearly impossible. As the captain struggled, other members of the crew launched a remote-controlled vehicle into the water to at least go down and try to find Chris. And so they decided they would just pilot straight to the underwater structure and begin looking around that area. And so for a few anxious minutes, the crew on board the ship watched the camera, which was the live feed coming from this underwater vehicle, as it went through totally dark water. And then at some point on the screen, the structure just appeared, and the vehicle, as it went up towards the top, it got a look at the very top of the structure. And on the screen, they saw Chris lying on his side, totally motionless. At this point, he had been without air for at least 20 minutes. In a last-ditch effort, the captain decided to completely power off the ship and its computer and just do a hard reset, something that you would never do, especially in rough seas, because if it doesn't come back on again, you are dead in the water. But when they turned it back on again, the ship came on and the computer system came back online, including the dynamic positioning computer. And so the captain immediately threw it on autopilot and the ship navigated right over where Chris's last position was. After Chris's umbilical had broken, Dave had managed to climb back up to the bell, and he was just standing underneath that platform right beneath it. And so when the ship got right back over Chris's position, Dave leapt off the platform, got to the seafloor, climbed up the structure, grabbed hold of Chris's body, and hauled him back up into the bell. Once Chris's body was inside the bell, Duncan, the bellman, removed Chris's helmet, and he saw that his face was blue and he was totally lifeless. But Duncan immediately just gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And after giving him 2 big breaths, Chris came back to life. He started gagging and coughing, and he's looking around wide-eyed, and Duncan and Dave are looking at him like, "You gotta be kidding me, you're supposed to be dead." And after about 30 seconds, the color in Chris's face had totally come back, and he was looking at Duncan and Dave and asked them, what happened? And Duncan and Dave didn't have an answer for him. And so instead, all three men just started laughing and hugging. They could not believe it. Once Chris was brought back up to the ship, the dive medic looked at him and concluded that nothing was wrong with him. He was perfectly fine, despite the fact he had been without an air supply for over 30 minutes. And 3 weeks after the incident, Chris was back down saturation diving again. Today, scientists don't know how Chris survived. The leading theory is that it was just so cold, it slowed his heart and his brain down, and that somehow kept him alive. But the reality is, his survival is a total mystery. Here is what the crew saw when their remote-controlled vehicle found Chris lying on top of that platform. On the morning of February 25th, 2015, in a little house in the city of Cape Town in South Africa, a 17-year-old girl named Misha Solomon was packing up her homework in between bites of her breakfast. And as she did this, her mother, Lavana, walked into the kitchen with a big smile on her face, and she was holding up this beautiful red flowing dress, and immediately Misha knew what it was. Her mom had been making this dress by hand over the past couple of days. It was for a big school dance that was coming up, and she saw that it was now done. And so Misha, she put down her breakfast and her homework, and she rushed over to her mom, and she admired this gorgeous dress and thanked her mom for all the hard work and said it's absolutely perfect. And then from somewhere behind Misha, her father, who was still sitting at the table, kind of grunted out, "Hey, isn't that dress a little bit revealing?" And Misha and her mom kind of just rolled their eyes because they knew Misha's dad just loved his daughter and was very, very protective of her. And so basically anything she wore that wasn't full coverage was too revealing. And so Misha, after rolling her eyes, walked over to her dad. She gave him a big hug and a kiss. And she said, "Dad, don't worry about it. It's just fine." And so after that, Misha went back to her breakfast. She finished eating, she packed up her stuff, and then she gave her mom and her dad another hug and a kiss and said goodbye. And then she headed out the front door out to the road where her aunt was waiting in her car. As Misha's aunt drove her to school, like she did almost every single morning, Misha began to notice her aunt was acting kind of strange and constantly looking behind her and looking in her rearview mirror. And finally, Misha said to her aunt, "What's going on? What are you looking at back there?" And Misha's aunt would say, "I know this sounds crazy, but I'm pretty sure there's a white car that's following me. And in fact, over the past couple of days, I've seen what I think is this same white car following us anytime I'm driving you to school." And so Misha just turned around in her seat and looked out the back window, and she saw there were dozens of white cars on the road. So it was pretty difficult to tell which one her aunt was talking about. But as she's looking, none of the cars seemed suspicious. And so Misha turned back around and told her aunt, "I think you're just being paranoid. Nobody's following us. There's no reason to follow us." A few minutes later, Misha's aunt pulled up alongside the front of the school, and Misha said goodbye to her aunt. She thanked her, she hopped outside, and she rushed into the school. And then Misha made her way up to the hallway where her first class was, and as she was walking down the hallway, her best friend, Cassidy Nurse, was walking up the hallway in her direction. And so right away, Misha sees Cassidy, and she waves and smiles and begins walking towards her. But Cassidy gave Misha this kind of weird, lukewarm smile, and then quickly looked away from Misha, and then Cassidy turned and bolted into the nearest classroom. And so Misha just came to a stop and just looked at the doorway where her best friend has disappeared, and she starts thinking to herself, what's going on? Why did she do that? That was so cold. And then Misha began to think about the fact that actually, over the past couple of days, Cassidy had been acting really strange. It was like she was trying to avoid Misha, but Misha had no idea why. It wasn't like they were fighting. Normally, Misha and Cassidy were totally inseparable. They had met earlier that school year, and even though they were actually kind of far apart in age, Cassidy was in 8th grade and Misha was in 12th grade, it was like it didn't matter. It was like right away when they met each other, they had this special bond where they just had to be around each other all the time. They shared everything with each other. And certainly anytime they saw each other in the hallway, they would stop to chat or even go into a nearby bathroom and do each other's hair and makeup and share any gossip they had recently heard. So for Cassidy to act like this was just totally uncharacteristic, and it really upset Misha. But just then, the bell rang in the school, so Misha knew at this point she was now late for her class, and so she had to forget about whatever was going on with Cassidy, and Misha just hustled down the hallway and went into her classroom. And so Misha, she takes her seat at her desk, she puts her stuff down, and she's getting ready to listen to the teacher, when suddenly the principal comes in without even knocking, and without even saying anything to Misha's teacher, the principal walks right up to Misha and says, "I need you to come with me." And right away, Misha's classmates, all who saw this, they begin oohing and awing as if Misha is in huge trouble. But Misha's thinking to herself, I didn't do anything. Like, I have no idea what this is about. And so she kind of smiled like it was no big deal. She picked up her stuff and she followed the principal out into the hallway. But as Misha followed the principal down the hallway towards the principal's office, Misha's smile faded and she began to wonder, what is this about? What's going on? And then finally, they got to the principal's office. The principal opened up the door. Misha went in first, and the principal trailed behind her and shut the door behind them. When Misha looked into the principal's office, she saw there were already two people inside who she didn't recognize. It was two women who were very serious looking, who were sitting on the side of the room. And as soon as Misha walked in, the two women, without introducing themselves, just told Misha to come over and take a seat next to them. And Misha, instead of doing that, just paused and looked at the women and said, "What's going on?" And at this, the two women kind of looked at each other, and then one of the women piped up and said, "Misha, we're here because the police sent us. And they sent us because of a photo that you and your very close friend Cassidy took." But before Misha could ask any questions like, what photo are you talking about and really what's going on here, these two women would explain the whole situation to Misha. And basically what they did is they told her this long, very convoluted story that involved Misha, it involved Cassidy, it involved this photo. And by the end of this story, this explainer story, Misha had taken a seat and put her hand over her mouth in utter disbelief. And then when the women were done explaining everything, Misha had a million questions, but it was like she was so overwhelmed with what she was just told that she just continued to sit there with her hand over her mouth, totally silent. And then finally, Misha did break the silence by saying, "Can I please just call my parents?" And at this, the social workers said, "No, you can't. And in fact, the police are already at your parents' house. They're talking to your parents right now. And so you can't talk to them and you can't even go home. In fact, you have to come with us for tonight." And then the two women got up and they made their way out of the principal's office and they said, "Come on, Misha, you have to come with us." And so Misha stood up and she's totally flabbergasted. She really is like, how is this real life? And the principal at this point walked over and gave Misha a hug. And it was like suddenly the floodgates opened and Misha just began sobbing hysterically. And as she did, the social workers just stood there waiting patiently. And then as soon as it seemed like Misha was done crying, they said, "Come on, you really need to come with us." And so Misha, she let go of the principal and she followed the two women out of the school out to one of their cars. And once they got in the car, the two women explained to Misha that they were going to take her to a safe house for the night. But before they went to the safe house, they would need to make a quick pit stop at a local medical clinic. And so Misha, who at this point is not even asking questions, just said, okay. And so the women, they drove to the medical clinic. They were inside for just a matter of minutes. When they came back out again, they drove the rest of the way to the safe house. And when they got to the safe house, it just looked like a normal house on the outside. But on the inside, when the two women were leading Misha through and showing her where everything was, the kitchen, the bathroom, her bedroom, all Misha saw was all these other kids who were staying there who were orphaned and abandoned. And it started to give Misha a panic attack. And she asked the women again, "Can I please call my parents?" And they said, "No, you really can't." But one of the two social workers could tell that Misha, she's having a breakdown. This is the worst day of her life, very likely. And so one of the two women actually offered to Misha to come home with her and stay at her house instead of the safe house. And Misha agreed. And so that social worker and Misha, they would leave together, they would get into that woman's car, and they would drive to her house. And then the social worker told Misha that unfortunately now it was just a waiting game. They needed to wait for the police to get back in touch with them with more information. That night, as Misha lay in this woman's guest bedroom, looking up at the ceiling, wondering how the heck this had become her life, she began to think about the photo that her and Cassidy had took that had kind of started this whole horrible thing. And so Misha began to think about the day they took this picture, and all she remembered was that she and Cassidy were just kind of goofing around and smiling and making funny faces and just taking photos as they went. She certainly didn't think that one of those pictures they took would totally change her life. The following morning, when Misha woke up, the social worker brought her to their office, the social worker's office, and there they met with the other woman who had first met Misha in the principal's office, and the three of them just sat in the office, not talking much, eating chicken wings and other snacks, just literally waiting for police to call them. And finally, they would call. And when they did, one of the social workers answered the phone, and as she listened to what she was being told, she began to frown, and by the time she hung up, she was crying. The news from the police was the news Misha had been afraid of ever since sitting in the principal's office the day before and hearing this whole crazy story about her and Cassidy and this photo. The special pit stop that Misha and the social workers made at the medical clinic the day before on the way to the safe house was so that Misha could get a DNA test. And now the police were calling back with the results of the test. And what the results showed was Misha Solomon was not actually Misha Solomon. Her real name was Zephany Nurse. 17 years earlier, Zephany Nurse had been stolen out of her crib at the hospital in Cape Town, and despite a massive manhunt for her, she was never found. And so this was a huge, famous case in Cape Town, and most people assumed it would never be solved. But Misha's DNA had done just that. It proved that Misha's parents, who had loved her and raised her since she was a baby, were not actually her parents. Her mother, Lavana, was actually her kidnapper, and now she was under arrest. But even though this revelation was incredibly shocking and upsetting for Misha, it was not nearly as shocking as learning the identity of her real biological parents. The social workers took Misha from their office to the police station, where they told Misha her real biological parents were waiting to meet her. And so once they went inside the police station, Misha gripped onto the social worker's arm tightly. She was incredibly nervous, and she was led down a hallway to a door that was shut. And then finally, when Misha was ready, she pushed the door open, and her real parents, who were sitting right in front of her, they stood up and they ran towards her crying. But Misha just stood there, stunned and silent, staring at them. Because these people, they were not strangers to her. She knew them extremely well. They were the parents of her best friend in the world, Cassidy Nurse. Which meant Misha, aka Zephany Nurse, was Cassidy's sister. Months earlier, when Misha and Cassidy first met each other, the reason they hit it off so quickly, and the reason they had similar senses of humor and liked the same things, and looked so dramatically similar, is because they were literally sisters. They just didn't know it. And then one day they took a series of selfie photos of themselves, and Cassidy, she would go home and show one of those photos to her parents and say, hey, look, my best friend, Misha Solomon, look how similar we look. And when Cassidy's parents looked at Misha Solomon, they instinctively knew, that is our daughter. That is Zephany Nurse. And so they would bring this photo to the police, and the police would begin to investigate. And during this investigation, they began trailing Misha. So when Misha's aunt told Misha that she thought a white car was following her, she wasn't just being paranoid. Those were investigators following Misha around, trying to get a feel for her schedule, because they needed to approach her when she was alone in order to get a DNA sample. They were worried if they contacted Misha and tipped off what they were doing, she would tell her parents, who were actually her kidnappers, and then potentially they might take Misha and run away. And so they couldn't risk that. They had to basically follow her around and wait for an opening to get this DNA test done. And so this was also the reason why Cassidy was acting so strangely towards Misha in the few days before the truth was revealed. It's because Cassidy knew about this investigation, and the police told her, you can't tip Misha off. She will tell her parents, her kidnappers, and they might abscond with her. And so Cassidy basically felt awkward and kind of just hid from Misha for a couple of days. The woman that Misha had grown up with and called her mom for her whole life, Lavana Solomon, was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. There has never been any evidence to suggest that Levana's husband, so Misha's dad for her whole life, actually knew that the baby had been kidnapped, because 17 years earlier, Levana had been pregnant with their child. But it's believed she miscarried, and Levana did not share that with her husband. Instead, she told her husband that she had gone into labor while he was at work and delivered their child, and so that's how they had this baby, Zephany, when in reality, after Levana had miscarried, she had at some point dressed up like a nurse, gone into the hospital, and stolen Zephany. For her part, Zephany, aka Misha, stayed in touch with both sets of parents, the fake ones and her biological ones. And she would say that, she still loves the parents who kidnapped her because they raised her and they treated her well. And in fact, Zephany would actually wear that beautiful flowing red dress that Levana had stitched for her to her high school dance, well after the news came out about who Levana was. Misha also decided that she would just keep the name Misha because that was what she was used to, instead of going back to her baby name, Zephany. There is still some debate about what exactly happened in this story that I'm about to share with you. And so for transparency, in this video, I am going to rely on the narrative that was presented in court by the defendant. And so with that in mind, here we go. On the afternoon of December 3rd, 2012, a freelance photographer working for the New York Post newspaper named Umar Abbasi was walking down the stairs of the 49th Street subway station in New York City. This very busy station is located only a few blocks away from the very famous Times Square. And so after Umar made his way down to this underground subway station, he walked over to one of the big automated kiosks that looks like an ATM, and he purchased a subway ticket. And then with his ticket, he walked over to the turnstiles. He slid his ticket through the slot, pushed past the turnstiles, and was now standing out on the actual train platform. And from where Umar was standing, this platform basically was like a huge sidewalk that stretched all the way to his right a couple hundred feet and all the way to his left a couple hundred feet. And in front of this platform were the actual tracks down below, because the train, when it came out of the tunnel, it would actually come right up alongside this platform with almost no clearance between the platform and the train. As such, the leading edge of the platform, basically the lip of the train platform that's closest to the train tracks, has this big yellow line painted all across it to keep commuters from standing too close to the edge, because if a train came through, they could actually get hit by the train. And so as Umar is standing on this platform and he's looking left and right, it's totally crowded with people, and they're all kind of tucked back against the wall away from this yellow line. And so Umar decides he's going to turn right and wait at the right end of the platform, just because he saw down at the far end there appeared to be a gap in people, and he figured he could stand right there. And so Umar begins navigating past all of these people on the right side of the platform, and for the most part, everyone he is passing either has their head buried in their phone, or they're listening to music, or both. Because the thing about riding trains, especially trains in busy cities, is none of the commuters want to talk to anybody else. They want to be completely left alone. And so as Umar is walking, everyone was basically doing that, but at some point he did pass two people that were engaged in a pretty heated conversation. Umar had no idea what they were arguing about, or if they were even arguing at all. He didn't know who these people were, but he took mental note of the fact that two men were kind of bickering with each other. And so he walked past them, didn't give it much of a second thought, and he arrived at a gap in the gaggle of people waiting for the train. And there he just stood well back of the yellow line, where he pulled out his camera and began clicking through the images he had taken earlier in the day at an earlier photo shoot. And so as he's clicking through these pictures, he starts to notice that those two men who had been bickering before are now straight up yelling at each other. They're screaming obscenities at each other. It's not clear who's fighting about what or who was the aggressor, but it's very obvious that at this point they're fighting. And so Umar looked away from his camera and looked left down the platform towards these two guys. And so these two guys are about 100 to 125 feet away from him, and all the people that were standing in the vicinity of these two men are beginning to migrate away from them. They just don't want anything to do with them, because the thing about being in subways, especially in cities like New York, is there's lots of people that go down into these train stations that are inebriated or mentally unstable, and so very strange and bad bad behavior is just kind of a normal thing, and people tend to just kind of ignore it. And so that's what's happening. People are kind of walking away from these two fighting men, doing their best to pretend it's not happening. And so Umar spent a couple more seconds staring down the platform at these two men, but eventually just shrugged and thought, you know what, whatever problems they have, they're not mine. And so Umar went back to his camera and continued to click through his pictures when all of a sudden he hears a scream coming from the left side of the platform. But it was not a scream that sounded like it came from either of these two men. And so Umar looked up from his camera and looked left down the platform, and now he just sees chaos. It's people running away from these two men. People are running to get away from whatever is happening around them. And so Umar's thinking these men must have come to blows and they're now fighting actively, physically with each other. But when finally the crowd kind of cleared for a second, he saw a woman pointing down at the train tracks right in front of where those two men had been standing. And so Umar looks at the woman and he follows her finger down onto the tracks, and he sees there is now a man, one of the two men who had been fighting, laying face down on the train tracks. And then, to Umar's horror, he looks up down the tunnel where the train would come out of, and he sees the headlights of the train. It is now coming into the station. And so Umar starts running down the platform to try to get to this man to pull him out of the tracks. And as he's running, he pulls out his camera and he turns the flash on and he holds the shutter down and he aims it at the train conductor to hope the flashing of his camera will alert the train conductor to put on the emergency brake and stop the train before he hits this guy down on the tracks. And so as Umar is running, trying to signal this train conductor, the man down on the tracks tries to stand up, and Umar sees he's really struggling to stand, and when he finally gets up, he turns and he grabs the edge of the platform and he tries to pull himself up and out of the tracks, but he doesn't have the strength or the coordination. And as Umar is getting closer and closer, but he's still too far away to help, he sees that this guy down on the tracks is not going to be able to get out of there before the train hits him. And so Umar finally comes to a stop and he watches as this man down on the tracks lets go of the lip of this platform and just turns and faces the train like he knows what's about to happen. And then seconds later, the train, although it did try to stop, impacted this man and killed him instantly. The man's name was Kaisar Khan, and he was 58 years old. When the police finally showed up, they arrested the other man who Han had been fighting with. He was a 30-year-old named Naeem Davis, and Davis would actually tell police that he had been fighting with Han and he had pushed him onto the tracks, but it was in self-defense. However, that self-defense story didn't stop him from being charged with murder. While Davis sat in jail waiting for his trial, the media and the public at large had already come to the conclusion that Davis was guilty. And this was due in large part to a particular picture. As Umar was running down the platform, holding up his camera, holding the flash down, trying to flag the train conductor to get him to stop, Umar was also taking dozens and dozens of pictures. And those pictures were of Han right before he was struck by the train. And so after Umar ultimately discovered he had taken these pictures, he gave them to his employer, the New York Post newspaper, and the day after the incident, they ran on the front page a picture of Han right before he's about to be killed with the headline, "Doomed." And so once the public saw this picture, nobody could believe that Davis was anything other than a cold-blooded killer for pushing this poor innocent man onto the tracks. But as it would turn out, nearly 5 years later, when Davis did finally get his trial, he was acquitted of all charges because it turned out Han was very drunk and had picked a fight with Davis, and Davis was filmed on more than one occasion on the platform trying to get Han to leave him alone. And so finally, after Han began making death threats and then grabbed Davis's shoulder, Davis turned around and pushed him, and Han, being drunk, stumbled and fell backwards onto the tracks and then was ultimately killed. Here is the infamous photo of Han on the cover of the New York Post newspaper. On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going, because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going head first into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go head first into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going head first into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd, because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him, with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm. He knew where he was in the cave. He just needed to get to that little pocket. He'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole. He'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him. But then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock. but his foot wouldn't budge. And so Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low. And he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness, I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in. And Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now, but Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful, he's very relieved, he says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself, and so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him, and then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time, but luckily Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked, and so Floyd was in good spirits and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Floyd began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him. And then all of a sudden, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above. And then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave. And periodically, rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever. Shortly before that cave-in first happened, a photographer took a picture of Floyd, who at the time believed he was going to get out, and all the rescuers believed they were going to get him out. But shortly after this photo was taken, the cave-in would happen, and at that point, Floyd didn't know it, but he was doomed. Here is that photo. Floyd's body was eventually removed from Sand Cave. However, instead of being buried, because of the interest around this cave rescue that ultimately failed, there was a decision made to actually put Floyd's body on display inside of another cave. Basically, Floyd's body became a tourist attraction. And it would remain a tourist attraction for decades until finally he was removed from that cave and given a proper burial.
Nel 1999, Alan Atadero soggiornava nella Comanche Wilderness, nel Colorado settentrionale, con i suoi due figli. Aveva con sé una figlia di 6 anni, Jocelyn, e un figlio, Jared, che all'epoca ne aveva 3. Alloggiavano al Pudre River Resort, di cui Alan era proprietario insieme al fratello gemello identico. Alan era lì per preparare il resort per l'inverno. Alan aveva divorziato di recente dalla moglie e si era unito a un gruppo di single cristiani. In qualche modo venne fuori che alcune persone del gruppo di single avevano chiesto se potevano soggiornare al Pudre River Resort con Allen e aiutarlo a preparare il resort per l'inverno in cambio di un alloggio gratuito per trascorrere una breve vacanza. Allen disse che era fantastico perché aveva davvero bisogno di aiuto. Non appena arrivarono, 11 membri del gruppo di single cristiani stavano parlando di andare al vicino vivaio statale di pesci. Jared e Jocelyn ne avevano sentito parlare ed erano davvero ansiosi di andarci con loro. Chiesero al padre Allan se andava bene. Allan si sentiva a suo agio con la partenza di Jocelyn, la figlia di 6 anni, ma era riluttante a mandare Jared perché ne aveva 3, era preoccupato che Sai sarebbe rimasto indietro ed era generalmente riluttante a mandare il più piccolo. Ma Jared voleva davvero andare e Jared stava dicendo beh, lascia andare Jocelyn, poi andare io. Allan, forse contro il suo buon senso, disse sì, puoi portare con te Jared. Jared odiava indossare le scarpe e chiese posso lasciare le mie scarpe? E Allan disse no, devi portare le tue scarpe. E Jared si oppose davvero. Non voleva indossare le sue scarpe. Allan disse ok, metti le scarpe Semplicemente non le allacciamo. Questo fu il compromesso che fecero. Gli misero le scarpe, non le allacciarono e se ne andò. Così il gruppo di single cristiani di 11 persone più Jocelyn e Jared partì verso l'incubatoio statale di pesci, ma senza chiedere il consenso di Allen. Invece di andare all'incubatoio statale di pesci, decisero di dirigersi verso il Big South Trail, che si trovava a circa 15 miglia a ovest del resort in cui si trovava Allen. Arrivarono all'inizio di questo sentiero, che è un sentiero molto accidentato, lungo 11 miglia, un sentiero stretto e piuttosto ripido. Si sale di quasi 10.000 piedi di altitudine. Questa era un'escursione accidentata, non era un'escursione per principianti. Ora non sappiamo esattamente qual è la cronologia, ma sappiamo che Jared e Jocelyn erano sicuramente nel gruppo di single cristiani quando iniziarono questa campagna, perché a un certo punto i single cristiani si divisero in un gruppo veloce e in un gruppo lento. E durante quel periodo in cui si separarono in due gruppi, Jared in qualche modo corse davanti a uno dei gruppi ed entrò in contatto con questi due pescatori che si trovavano sul Big South Trail. Il Big South Trail si trovava vicino a una zona di pesca mosca di livello mondiale e questi due uomini stavano pescando a mosca e hanno visto Jared e anche questi due gruppi di persone che si arrampicavano su questo sentiero e i pescatori hanno pensato che dovesse essere con loro. Jared si è avvicinato a loro e ha detto: "Ehi, avete visto orsi in zona?" E loro hanno risposto no. E Jared è semplicemente scappato via. Si ritiene che i due pescatori che hanno visto Jared sul sentiero siano stati gli ultimi due a vederlo vivo. A un certo punto, poco dopo che Jared ha preso contatto con questi due pescatori, il gruppo di single si è reso conto di aver perso le tracce di Jared. Hanno Jocelyn, ma hanno perso di vista Jared. E così hanno iniziato subito a cercare nella zona. Hanno chiamato Jared e dopo circa un'ora non l'hanno trovato. Tuttavia, uno dei membri dei single cristiani ha sentito un urlo. Non era l'urlo di qualcuno che veniva attaccato, ma piuttosto era molto lontano, sai, dal sentiero. Sembrava un bambino che, secondo loro, urlava allegro, come se stesse giocando con qualcuno, come se stesse giocando a rincorrersi o a nascondino. Hanno cercato di raggiungere quella zona, ma non sono riusciti a individuare la provenienza del suono e nonostante urlassero costantemente per chiamare Jared, non sono mai riusciti a localizzarlo. Mentre la ricerca è in corso, uno dei membri se ne va e torna al resort per dare la notizia ad Allan, il padre di Jared. Allan sale subito in macchina, grida: "Hai perso il mio bambino?" e guida fino al Big South Trail. Allan pensava di riuscire a scendere e a correre come un pazzo chiamando suo figlio a gran voce e di trovarlo, ma si rende subito conto che si tratta di una zona molto accidentata e molto densamente popolata. Sarà quasi impossibile per lui da solo cercare e trovare suo figlio. Chiama le autorità e le autorità si presentano e danno il via a questa massiccia ricerca. Quando la squadra di ricerca e soccorso si è presentata era molto fiduciosa di riuscire a trovare Jared. Avevano la sensazione di avere un'idea precisa di dove si trovasse e che sarebbe stato molto difficile per lui andare da qualche parte. Avevano sentito il pescatore dire di averlo visto. Uno dei membri aveva sentito un urlo in una zona specifica. Purtroppo hanno fatto queste ricerche molte volte e il più delle volte hanno trovato il bambino nascosto da qualche parte che piangeva da qualche parte, ma non sono stati ascoltati. Il giorno dopo ben 24 ore di ricerche in cui non avevano trovato nulla, è stato allora che la squadra di ricerca e soccorso ha iniziato a rendersi conto che molto probabilmente non sarebbe stata una ricerca di successo. Le ricerche sarebbero andate avanti per una settimana. Erano state ricerche molto caotiche. Il caso aveva fatto notizia a livello nazionale e quindi le persone si stavano dirigendo verso questa zona del Colorado solo per essere testimoni di questo caso. C'erano volontari che si presentavano a destra e a manca per aiutare nelle ricerche. La polizia ha dovuto impedir loro di entrare nella zona perché non volevano ingombrare l'area di ricerca. Quindi era tutto molto caotico e in quel periodo si è schiantato anche un elicottero che stava cercando Jared. Fortunatamente nessuno è morto nell'incidente, ma è stata una ricerca folle durata circa una settimana e non hanno trovato nulla. Una settimana dopo l'inizio delle ricerche le hanno ufficialmente interrotte. E la teoria più accreditata era che Jared fosse stato attaccato da un leone di montagna. 4 anni dopo, due escursionisti si trovavano nella stessa zona sul Big South Trail e stavano risalendo il sentiero. Quando sono arrivati a questa sezione, vicino dove Jared era scomparso, hanno scoperto che c'era una salita rocciosa molto ripida che non faceva parte del sentiero. Ma se volessi fossi abbastanza avventuroso e atletico, è fattibile che potresti arrampicarti, sai, a quattro zampe su per questa parete rocciosa e potresti arrivare a questo affioramento roccioso da cui avresti una splendida vista sul canyon. E così questi due escursionisti decidono di farlo. Quindi iniziano a scalare questo pendio roccioso che definirebbe una scalata pericolosa. In realtà David Politis, l'uomo dietro il progetto 411 mancante, gira un video in cui si arrampica su quella parete rocciosa e sembra molto ripida e difficile da percorrere. Quindi questi due escursionisti arrivano a questo affioramento e la prima cosa che notano è un paio di scarpe da ginnastica nuove di zecca per bambini, scarpe da ginnastica bianche. E non appena le vedono pensano, oh, immagino che ci sia una famiglia qui sopra. E lasciano che il loro bambino si tolga le scarpe. E così si guardano intorno alla ricerca, sai, della famiglia che deve essere stata semplicemente avventurosa e si è arrampicata fin qui, ma non c'è nessuno lassù, ed è una zona piccola. E pensano, cosa ci fanno queste scarpe qua su? Poi hanno trovato pezzi di vestiti di Jared vicino alle scarpe. I suoi pantaloni sono stati trovati rivoltati al rovescio, completamente rivoltati. La sua felpa era più o meno intatta. Sia la felpa che i pantaloni avevano tutti i segni di essere stati all'aperto per 4 anni, con le intemperie, l'esposizione agli elementi, erano sfilacciati e laceri. Anche le scarpe, apparentemente, erano state esposte agli elementi per 4 anni, ma non mostravano quasi alcun segno di usura. Gli escursionisti che le hanno trovate hanno pensato letteralmente che fossero scarpe nuove di zecca. E poi in quella zona hanno anche trovato uno dei denti di Jared e un osso che apparteneva sempre a Jared. Quindi sorge spontanea la domanda: come ha fatto Jared ad arrivare a quasi 160 metri sopra il sentiero, su un terreno estremamente impervio? E perché le sue scarpe non erano affatto rovinate dopo 4 anni di esposizione agli elementi? E perché le sue scarpe si trovavano lassù? Erano slacciate ai suoi piedi. Di sicuro non sarebbe stato in grado di muoversi su quel terreno nemmeno con le scarpe allacciate. Ma se si fosse mosso su quel terreno, avrebbe quasi sicuramente perso le scarpe. Quindi non sappiamo cosa abbia effettivamente portato alla morte di Jared. Tuttavia, sappiamo che in qualche modo è stato trovato, i suoi resti sono stati rinvenuti in un'area che era di fatto inaccessibile per lui.